Welcome back to the Take Aim with Your Podcast session here at castos.com. I'm recording this a little under the weather, so I apologize. It sounds different working out of my office today and not the studio. And I want to talk to you about a concept that really summarizes, I think, over a decade of podcasting experience now. But as somebody who helps other folks get their podcast off the ground, I think I can really funnel in or really focus in, punch in, if you will, to three key areas to running a successful podcast and try to bottle it up in a nice takeaway fashion for you to at least zoom out and think about either the podcast that you're running now or the podcast that you hope to launch here in the future. So I've created this little checklist. Again, it's called Take Aim with Your Podcast. And we'll start with attention, the A in AIM, attention. And attention around your podcast or attention around your brand or your product or your service is no different. See, podcasting is really like running a business as much as we don't want to admit that. Like anything, we need to strive for attention to our little corner of the internet. With at least of the recording time, there are now over 4 million podcasts, not all of them active, but still 4 million to go through. So we need attention. How are we going to get attention in a world where I have 14 subscription services? Aftermath of cord cutting has now brought us even more selection when we thought we were slimming it down. Attention. So step one in attention. Deliver awareness to your audience. Deliver awareness to your audience. You must deliver the awareness to your audience because the audience will not be aware of you, at least in the beginning. So this first bullet point is one that hopefully sets the tone for a lot of the stuff that you'll experience in podcasting, at least in my eyes. But if you're starting with no audience, you don't have an existing YouTube channel, Instagram following, email list, you're not a local, semi-regional, national, global celebrity, you're starting with nothing. You must deliver the awareness to your audience. When you sit back and conceptualize what your podcast is going to be about, chances are you're thinking about who that audience is for as well. So you know what the content is, or at least what content you want to talk about, and you have somewhat of an idea of who the listener is, where she might go online, or where she might be in Facebook groups, or he might be in Discord servers, or things like that. And in the early days, you got to deliver that awareness to the audience. You have to go where they are and say, hey, I got a podcast. As much as you might not feel comfortable with that in the early days, believe me, once you start putting in the work to produce a podcast and you see what goes into producing a podcast, you will quickly realize that the amount of time and effort you put in to the podcast that you care so much about is worth a lot. That time that you've invested is worth a lot. Therefore, you might not feel as bad saying, hey, I got something very valuable. I need to show it to people. And you might feel more inclined to knock on somebody's door, join a Facebook group, hop in a Discord server, jump in a Twitter thread, and just say, hey, I'm out there. I got this great thing and I want you to see it. That's what I mean about delivering awareness. And it doesn't just stop at day one. I still do this, whatever 10 times 365 is. That's how many days I still continue to throw my shows out there to get people to see it. Collaborate in guest appearances. So chances are you might be doing an interview show. A lot of us start off with an interview show, and even if it's just a solo monologue show, every now and again you might sprinkle in a guest here and there. And collaboration with your guests of your show is a fantastic way to grow that audience, to grow awareness. Simple things like having your guest talk about the fact that they'll be on your show, sharing the episode when it's over, asking their audience to prepare questions, maybe for you or what you want them to see, but then collaborating with others. What other media outlets can you collaborate with on sharing the podcast, getting other content from, doing blog posts, your basic collaboration. You got to keep that top of mind if you want this attention. And guest appearances on other podcasts are a fantastic way to grow your podcast. When it comes to ranking first in Google, right? Remember the days where you could actually rank first in Google? But either way, ranking in search engines, it takes building links. It takes building links out to other websites, links in your own content, people linking back to your web property, your podcast. Guest appearances are the most valuable thing you could do to grow your audience. I don't want to spend too much time on that. It's fairly obvious these days. Number 3, spend a majority of time promoting. So this is pretty simple and one that a lot of folks overlook because we're so busy and we generally jump into podcasting from advice from folks like me and others, and we just say, create, ship, get that content out there, rinse, repeat, do it again, keep doing it as much as you possibly can, post on Instagram, make your newsletter, make the blog post, all that stuff, do all these things. And then before you know it, you're just spending 100% of your time creating content. And you forgot to deliver that awareness to the audience or get it out into the world. At the very minimum, posting on social media, your favorite social media platform of choice, whatever that might be, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. When folks come to me and they say, look, the most that I can do for my podcast is once a week. And that's tremendous if you can do that. But ask yourself, if you're going to do a weekly podcast, does that completely max you out? Like you have no time for anything else, literally no time for anything else. If I said, could you spend a couple hours a week promoting an episode? Could you do that at 4 episodes a month with everything else you have to do? The answer is no. I can barely fit my shoes on aside from promoting on, and then also to promote on social media. You don't have that time. Cut your production time in half. Don't do 4 episodes, do 2 episodes a month. And believe me, spend those off weeks promoting the heck out of your show, making those connections, sharing the episodes. It will pay off tremendously as time marches on. You don't want to go through a year. The worst thing you could do is burn out, number 1, but that, creeps up on you either pretty quick or not, which is even worse, is when you go a year and you're like, man, nobody's listening to the show. And then it's just like a depression of why have I spent all this time creating content? Spend a majority of your time in the beginning promoting. 1 episode a month, promote for 3 weeks. That's amazing if you can do that. Spend more time promoting, certainly in the beginning. And lastly, attention, and I just hinted on this, audio, video, text, social, and email. You have to do all the things. And the more you can do, the more attention you'll get. And this is what I mean about podcasting being a lot of work. If you can spend time, obviously, creating the audio, that's why we're all here doing a podcast. But if you can turn that into video clips, or if you're recording video at the source of the time that you're creating the podcast, you have that extra asset there that you can send on YouTube or LinkedIn or whatever. You can use it as clips. You can make audiograms out of it, make a blog post out of your podcast episodes, certainly sharing this stuff out on social, and then an email list to drive even deeper engagement and awareness and attention to the podcast. There's a bunch of stuff you can do here. The idea is one episode can go out to a half a dozen places. Now, that should be fairly apparent these days because there's a lot of tools, especially here at Castos, that make that happen for you, right? Like on our growth plan, you can automatically publish your episodes to YouTube and you can create audiograms from that. But all of this stuff will lead back to that podcast episode, or gives you opportunity to create new and fresh content that links and interconnects. Okay, so that's my broad brushstroke on attention onto your podcast. How can you think about it? How can you do it? What are some ways to look at increasing attention? Which hopefully brings us to that next step is once you capture that attention, How do you keep them interested? How do you get that interest? Okay, I heard about Jane's new podcast, but am I really interested in it? Like, I saw that cool video clip that you did or that awesome cover art graphic that you shared on LinkedIn, but am I really interested in this particular show? And for me, it's really refining your show's premise at the outset. I want to know that what's the reason, what's the purpose behind this show? 4 million plus podcasts for me to listen to. Why am I going to listen to this one? And does it have the proper hook to keep me hooked, to get me hooked in the beginning? Really working on refining your show's premise. Entrepreneurs talking to entrepreneurs, that's just a blanket statement. Cupcake makers talking to other New Jersey bakeries, a lot more refined right there. It was just something that just flew off the top of my head. But if you're refining the show's premise, at least to that next layer, car rental owners, music maker agencies talking to other entrepreneurs, like really refining that premise. And I'll tell you that it takes time. So you work on refining the show's premise at the beginning, but you constantly refine it over time. And there's nothing wrong with that. You want to run with a particular premise for the first year and then change it in another year. That is perfectly fine. 6 months, do it. As long as you're actively thinking about it and it's something that you have strong beliefs in. Which sort of leads us into this next one, is having an opinion. Everyone has opinions, I know, but you really want to make this sort of shine through in your content. I don't want to say brand, but as a show host, you want to be entertaining, you want to be educating, and you want to be informing, right? So pick one of those three, but you should have some type of opinion because that's really what's going to create the bond with your listener. Especially over time, it might start to broaden a little bit and you'll have some people listening, but you'll have those diehard listeners in the beginning are there for you. They're going to be there for you for a decade. Put yourself in your own shoes and think of yourself as a content consumer. Which radio personality do you listen to? Which YouTube channels do you watch? What makes you keep coming back to fill in the blank show? Generally, it's either going to be like a super refined premise, like Hot Ones on YouTube, which is celebrities eating hot chicken wings with like really hot sauce. And there's an increase of hot sauce as they move down the chicken wings. And Sean Evans, the host, is interviewing them and telling a story about them and whatever they might be promoting at the time. But the idea there is they're there for the premise of the show, and then they're there for you, the person, the host. Like, I think Chris Evans is a great host. And if he wasn't asking amazing questions and doing deep research, it would be just like a game show where it's like, yeah, you tune in and you leave. But you want to go back because you always know that the interview is going to be fantastic. Have an opinion. Which leads into never settling. And I promise you that this is something that shines through when you're constantly working on the show, you're constantly letting that opinion out there, and you're always working hard for the show. You're never settling on the production value, the content quality, the guest quality, the story arc, the seasonality of it. This is going to build interest. This is what's going to really build or the roots, the bond of your audience. Never settling at any of this stuff. Right? Never just, I'm just done. Like, all I need is this one thing and my podcast is going to be amazing. You should never settle for where you're at. Even if it takes you a year to get that next notch better, as long as you don't give up on that, that will shine through. I'm a big believer in that, and which will increase the interest of your audience. And lastly, in this section, and none of these sections are really, it's not definitive. There are other areas that you can invest in any one of these A.I.M areas, but invest in community. So engaging the audience is the number one driving force for your show. So you're always investing in your audience. And you're doing that in ways that hopefully engage them by feedback, reading their reviews, getting them on the show, engaging with them on social media, doing something like a Discord server or a Slack channel or a forum. Facebook group is very popular, right? Invest in the community often and early, and you'll continue to drive more and rich interest in your show. Invest in community audience is number one. Okay. Last, but certainly not least, is monetize. The M and final segment in A.I.M. Take A.I.M. with your podcast. Email list or service. So if you want to monetize your show, there's a lot of folks out there that want to make some money with the show, advertising sponsors. They're looking at it like they look at YouTube, where you can turn on YouTube ads and start to generate income, that kind of thing. You're a brand or personality, et cetera, et cetera. For those of you that have nothing, you're starting from scratch. Again, no audience, never gone into monetizing content before. Start with an email list or a service, right? The bare minimum, there's value in building an email list. So even if you have nothing to sell today, you can't make a nickel on advertising spots, which I'll talk about in a later video. Email list is currency. You can get a call to action in your podcast that says, hey, never want to miss another episode of my podcast. Go to mattreport.com/subscribe. Join that email list. It's the number one way to stay connected. I say that on my podcast. You start to build up a list of people, and you know that the folks who have taken that action, that verbal cue, that verbal call to action to join the email list, those are valuable contacts to build on a list. So it's a form, at least for me, of way of monetizing your show. You might not have something to sell immediately, but they're there and ready to go whenever you hit launch on whatever it is your next product or service is. So you can dovetail the email list into a future product or service. Great way to monetize the show. It doesn't have to be through ads and sponsorships in your traditional media route. You can have a podcast and you can sell products and services. This is exactly how I built a digital agency a little while ago. Is I had a digital agency. I started a podcast, and people would hear me on my podcast, and people would hire me to build them websites. It's a very easy sort of flow to that. So that's one way of monetization. Ads or sponsorship. Let me just kill this. Ads or sponsorships for your show. So you can do the traditional ad or sponsorship route where you have available slots for people to advertise, or you work a little bit closer with content sponsorships. And a few ways you can go about this is you can go into ad networks. I'm not going to spend too much time on that in this video. But if you're starting from nothing, just dipping into an advertising pool is going to be very difficult for you to earn money, if at all. And places like podcorn.com have ad networks that you can connect to. There's competitors to Castos that promise you podcast advertising deals and stuff like that, and they do a revenue share with you. Very hard if you don't have a lot of downloads. And by a lot of downloads, probably tens of thousands of downloads, if not at least 10,000 downloads a month. And then there's the more deeper, what I say is like a deeper engagement or connection, is you find a sponsor of the show. Somebody who will sponsor the entire show. It's not this sort of randomized ad inventory. They really care about content and aligning, that's what it's about, I think, aligning their brand with your efforts and the message that you put out. Again, go back to interest for a second. This is why it's important to have an opinion, to refine your show's premise and engage with community and never settle, because when you go for direct sales, let's say, for a sponsor of the show, you are your best salesperson, obviously, and brands will look at you first to align with, not just the audience or just the content. They want to know that you'll do brand ad reads well for them, but also that there's a connection there. And vice versa, you should be looking after the same thing. Like, you only want to work with brands that want to support your efforts, your opinion, your cause, your community. We'll talk more about that in future videos. Another method for community monetization is the community-supported model. You ask for donations. Buy Me a Coffee from buymeacoffee.com is a great way of doing this. There's the whole Podcast 2.0 value for value system, which is very cutting and bleeding edge. So I'll just say it here. I have other videos on that. Technology-wise, it's pretty far out, but it still is a thing. And community-supported podcasts are probably the most popular, where you ask for donations, you ask for an exchange of value for listening to the show. What kind of value did a person get out of listening to your show? And you say, you can give me money based on where you find value. And typically you see it from like that buymeacoffee.com model, where it's, hey, you $5. You give me $5 minimum to buy a Starbucks coffee, because that's literally the cost. And that's the exchange, right? So community supported models, and it's not just handing money over. It could be memberships, could be digital products, it could be something else. It could be tickets to an online event or an in-person event, that kind of thing. And lastly, the most popular one these days would be that subscription model, where maybe you have a private podcast, you have value-added content, extra content, ad-free content, something like that. You can have your subscription-based podcast. We make that hopefully easy for you here at Castos, where you can launch private podcasts or associated to an email address. Person gives you some money. That email address, once they give you money, goes into your Castos database. The database says, hey, we get this private podcast made by Matt. Do you want to subscribe to it? The answer is probably yes. And then they can listen to it right in the Castos app or on their favorite podcast player. So the subscription model has been popular now for a couple of years. The private podcasting has. Apple and Spotify, quite literally earlier this year, 2020, got into the game of doing subscriptions, and Apple takes 30%. So in typical Apple fashion, they take 30%. So monetizing private podcasts, we do that here. Again, super easy here at Castos. It's taking aim with your podcast. It's getting the mindset before you get into that podcast, thinking about your podcast, thinking about growing a successful podcast. Take aim before you start your next podcast. Want to start a podcast? Go to castos.com. Start your free 14-day free trial. I said that twice. Check out how to launch your show at castos.com. Join our free academy.castos.com. Thumbs up if you like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want more. Sorry for a little under the weather. Different kind of setup again, but we hope you enjoyed the content. All right. See you in the next video.